What's up, YouTube? Capital G here. So it looks like everybody's doing their Onslaught of the Fire King structure deck opening. Unfortunately, I haven't picked mine up yet. But nevertheless, that is not going to stop me from talking about the archetype, its viability, how I think it's going to do in this meta, predictions on how it might do in the next meta, and just, my overall views and opinions on the deck so far from the little bit that we know about it and the little bit of cards that have been actually released in the TCG. Now, one common term that I use on this channel a lot is boss monster or bust. That basically means that you're a deck where a lot of your win condition is directly tied to you summoning your boss monster consistently, and wins get a lot more difficult if you don't. Now, I've looked at this deck, I've dueled against it, and I think so much of this deck's success is going to be directly predicated on getting your boss monster out. The boss monster is the Fire King High Avatar Gurunix. You guys probably already know it. 2700 beat stick. It's basically like Sacred Nymphes on crack. If it's destroyed by a card effect in any way, it gets summoned back to the field on the next standby phase, not necessarily your standby phase. It can come back on your opponent's standby phase. And then basically it activates Dark Hole. It just blows everything up. And if you happen to destroy it by battle and it goes to the graveyard, then you can special summon any Fire King monster you want, as long as it's not another copy of Gurunix. It has to go to the graveyard to resolve any of these effects. So that card is absolutely amazing, and I guess you could say to a lesser extent you could throw Sacred Phoenix of Nymphes in there, because Nymphes is very important because you can special summon Nymphes with Onslaught of the Fire Kings. You can trade it out with the Circle of the Fire Kings too, and Nymphes is really good against the Fire Fist matchup because it controls their back row. In addition, it rapes decks that have to rely on field spells, decks like Dark World, Gravekeepers, so on and so forth. Now, this deck definitely has some huge ups, but it does have some fallbacks right now, or some drawbacks. Let's say that. One huge upside is that Gurunix is just a fucking monster of a card. I mean, it renders things like Torrential Tribute, Mirror Force, Dark Hole completely mute. If your opponent would happen to Mirror Force this, your opponent TTs it, then they can't really commit to the board, considering he's just going to come back on your opponent's turn. So not only at the very least do they have to answer a 2700 monster, if they don't remove it, if they kill it anyway by outside of removing it, it's either going to come back and just torch the field again, or you're at the very least just going to get another copy of, maybe an 1800 Fire King. So it's a very, very difficult card to deal with. Now, the card, much like Sacred Phoenix of Nymphes, is not immortal. I mean, there are ways to get around this, and some of the biggest threats to this card obviously are Dimensional Prison, Bottomless Trap Hole, and then Macrocosmos. We won't really talk about Macro because Macro pretty much rapes everything. But Dimensional Prison and Bottomless Trap Hole, these are common cards, generally seen in twos. However, the way that this deck is structured, where so much of your win condition is going to come off your boss monster, not only do you have the Circle of the Fire Kings, which you can instantly tribute. You can target your Gurunix, destroy it, get another monster, and attack again, so that you can avoid the Bottomless, or you can avoid the Deep Prison. But I mean, again, that's just going to trigger its effect. So on your opponent's next turn, it's just going to come back to the field, blow everything up. Not to mention, I would just imagine it would be common sense to play at least a couple copies of Forbidden Lance in this deck, so that you don't have to worry about those two particular cards. Onslaught of the Fire Kings is what makes this entire deck playable, because it not only does it give you a 2700 beater straight from your fucking deck, and it doesn't have any life point cost. You still can normal summon that turn, so chances are you can special summon this guy, run something over, and then again, if your opponent really can't Mirror Force you, they can't Torrential you, because those cards are just completely irrelevant. Now, I will say this. The support cards are pretty decent. Bongrong and Yasha, they're pretty good. They're 1800 beaters. I like the fact that they can be special summoned when your big guys are destroyed. The problem is, I don't think your opponent is just going to be throwing Mirror Forces, Dark Holes, and Torrentials at you unless they're really trying to push for game or something like that. However, with that being said, this also allows you to push for game. Let's say your opponent is at 1,000 life points and you attack with Gurunix, and they're like, okay, well, if I don't Mirror Force you, I lose. They activate Mirror Force. Okay, well, special summon Yaska from the hand, attack again for game. That's one of the neat things about this deck. Now, Balrog, he's okay. You know what I mean? I like the fact that he does search for a card, because let's say your opponent Torrentials your Gurunix, you know what I mean, and you special Barong, and you end your turn. Well, Gurunix is going to come back to the field, torch the field, Barong's going to die. He will search for a card, you know, and he can search for any Fire King card. You wouldn't want to search for Gurunix, because, like, you don't ever want Gurunix in your hand. That's one of the bad things about this deck. But it does allow you to get the circle, which is, again, pretty much like a pseudo Forbidden Lance-ish type deal. I mean, it basically makes it so your monster doesn't get, like, deprisoned or some shit like that. Now, one thing I haven't been able to put my finger on is how this deck is going to combat with D.D Crow. Now, one big silver lining about the whole D.D Crow aspect is I look at D.D Crow and it's an absolute fantastic card against Fire Kings. It's a killer of this deck. Unfortunately, you look at D.D Crow in the grand scope of the meta and it's like not useful against Mako Rabbit, not useful against Wind Up, not useful against Fire Fits. It's probably not going to be useful against the Verge, as they'll be coming out in the upcoming format. Are people really going to be maxing out on 3 copies of D.D Crow just for one deck, the Fire Kings? So you might actually end up playing against people who aren't maxing on D.D Crow, and that's just going to work to your advantage. One major problem that I see with this deck is in the early game. I mean, this deck can have a tendency to start off slow, and it's pretty evident that Gurunix and Nephies are pretty much going to be doing the heavy lifting. Those are the cards that have the resistance to destruction. They're going to be what battles over the big monsters that your opponent puts on the field. You know, so if you're in the early game and all you have is like Barong or Yaska, I mean, these cards really aren't doing anything. Your opponent probably isn't going to want to use, you know, removal on them. They're just going to try and run them over in battle, because 1800 isn't exactly hard to get over. And if you don't have early game access to Onslaught, it's going to be a long day for you. Let alone if you draw Sacred Phoenix of Nephews, or if you draw Gurunix, the cards are completely dead in your hand. I mean, there really isn't a way to get them out of your hand. There isn't much you can do. I mean, they have this other support card, but it's really not that good. So, you know, I think that trade-in might actually be a viable option, because Gurunix is level 8, Sacred Phoenix is level 8. You can get them back with the circle. You know, I think that can be pretty decent. And then one more card that might actually be pretty decent that can, you know, maybe mitigate some of those awkward hands is Karkar-D. I mean, I look at this deck and I see a deck that is completely focused on getting its boss monsters out ASAP. A deck that shouldn't really even attempt to play defense, to be honest, outside of things like Torrential Tribute, which are going to trigger your guys. I mean, what type of defense do you really need? I wouldn't be concerned about Mirror Force and whatnot. So I think Karkar-D might actually fit well into this deck. I think the deck is probably going to play hand traps galore, cards like Tragodia, because you don't really want to invest too many monsters on the field, considering Gurunix is just going to blow shit up anyway. So let me know what you guys think about this deck. I think that it's going to be pretty cool. I think that the deck is going to be viable. If I'm just going to take a wild guess, I'm going to say tier 2. The whole D.D Crow element macro might be really big next format. I think that might be a little too much for the deck to be tier 1, but I think it will be competitive nonetheless. Thank you guys for watching as always, and I'll talk to you later.